All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started because we just have a great program today. So welcome everyone to the latest Drawdown Georgia webinar in our series, Climate Solutions That Go Beyond Carbon. My name is Blair Beasley, and I am the Director of Climate Strategies for the Ray C. Anderson Foundation. We have been proud to support Drawdown Georgia and its efforts to grow high-impact climate solutions in our state. I'm excited for this discussion about shaping Georgia's energy future. We have some amazing speakers lined up to talk about the latest Georgia Power Integrated Resource Plan and how Drawdown Georgia climate solutions like large-scale solar and energy efficiency are impacted by what comes out of the Georgia Public Service Commission. The research that underpins Drawdown Georgia identified 20 high-impact solutions for our state that, if scaled to ambitious but achievable levels, could collectively cut our state's greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030 as compared to 2005 levels. The pathway for growing many of these solutions runs in part through the IRP process and decisions made at the Public Service Commission. As we'll talk about today, how climate solutions grow in our state will impact our state's carbon footprint, as well as the communities and individuals who live here. So a few quick programming notes before we dive in. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel for today, and then following their presentation, we will be opening it up to the audience for Q&A. So please add your questions as you think of them to the chat box, and I'll do my best at the end to get to as many of them as possible. So first, we'll be hearing from Kevin Kelly. Kevin is an independent policy advisor to South Face Institute and is a principal with Kirkwood and Kelly Consulting, where he assists clients with projects in the area of natural resource conservation and utility operations. He has previously held positions at the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority, the Environmental Protection Division of Georgia, as well as the Turner Foundation. Then we'll hear from Dr. Marilyn Brown. Dr. Brown is a Regents Professor in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech, where she created and co-leads the Climate and Energy Policy Lab and the Master of Sustainable Energy and Environmental Management. She also co-directs the research program supporting Drawdown Georgia, which we're very grateful for. Dr. Brown's research focuses on the design and modeling of energy markets and carbon reduction policies and programs. And then finally, we'll hear from Cicely Garrett. Cicely is the Interim Just Energy Director at the Partnership for Southern Equity. She's also a creative strategist and social entrepreneur, providing thought leadership and consulting on strategy, design thinking, racial equity, environmental justice, food sovereignty, and community wealth building. Cicely spearheaded the production of Resilient Atlanta and the transition of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability to the Office of Resilience under the 100 Resilient Cities program. As I said, this is a really exciting group. So with that, Kevin, I'm going to turn the mic over to you to kick off our program.
All right, thanks, Blair. Can you hear me okay? Is my volume all right?
Sounds great.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you for a few minutes about the Georgia Power 2022 IRP. I'm going to start with the acronym, just because I'm going to use it extensively. It probably get used extensively and has already. So just make sure that everyone keeps in mind what it stands for is the Integrated Resource Plan, which I'll keep calling the IRP. Go ahead, next slide. So I want to start with talking about why is the IRP important? Why do we care? And so it's true that the IRP only applies to one of Georgia's 95 electric utilities, but it does chart the energy future of the state's biggest electric utility, Georgia Power. Georgia Power serves about 2/3 of the electricity demand in the state. And in many ways, the IRP is the closest thing Georgia has to a state energy planning process. And the IRP is an inflection point. It only happens every 3 years. And so it's an important point in the development of where are we going with Georgia's energy resources. I'd also underscore that most of Georgia's solar development over the last decade has been driven by decisions in past IRPs. And this IRP will continue that trend. It will continue to shape Georgia's solar future, both in terms of how much utility scale solar and how much distributed solar is developed in the state. And Georgia Power also proposes to expand its subscription programs. And I think that's an important conversation about how solar gets done in the state. And then finally, Georgia Power also operates the largest utility-sponsored energy efficiency program in the state, and the IRP shapes the scope of that program. And again, another kind of important equity issue comes up in that the Georgia Power proposes to expand its low-income energy efficiency programming, and that'll be an important conversation during the 2022 IRP. Go ahead, next slide. So what is the IRP, or what is the Integrated Resource Plan? In the simplest terms, the IRP is a 20-year plan for an investor-owned utility, in this case, Georgia Power, to meet its obligation to serve its customers. So the IRP starts, and really the heart of the IRP is the utility's energy and demand forecast for the coming 20 years. And then the plan describes how will the utility meet that demand. And so to fulfill this requirement, the utility has to consider a range of questions. Some examples are, what will economic development look like over the next 20 years? Consequently, how will load grow? What plants will the utility retire, and what new generating capacity does the utility need? What transmission improvements are needed to maintain reliable service across the state? And then some of the questions that we'll focus on is, what are the benefits of adding new renewable energy resources to the system? And how would the implementation of energy efficiency or demand response help meet the forecasted load? Georgia Power is required every 3 years to come before the Public Service Commission to refresh this 20-year plan. So this opportunity doesn't come up again until 2025. Go ahead, next slide. So I want to highlight the main procedural milestones in the proceeding, this proceeding that will span roughly 5.5 months schedule. And the first step really has already happened. The IRP docket started with Georgia Power filing its 2022 Integrated Resource Plan at the end of January. Around the same time, the Georgia Public Service Commission, and to do another acronym, sometimes I will say PSC, referring to the Georgia Public Service Commission, they approved the procedural and scheduling order, what's sometimes called the PSO, which lays out the schedule for the proceeding. If you want to review the filing, it's actually pretty easy to do on the Public Service Commission's website, and I would encourage folks to do that. It is useful to pay attention to those docket numbers in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. They're kind of the key to finding what you need. So 44160 is the docket number assigned to the 2022 IRP. 44161, they separately filed the demand-side management plan. And so you can go on the website, and there's a docket search engine there. And if you put that number in there, you'll get all of the documents that have been filed in the proceeding. So next is discovery and data requests. In any PSC docket, the Public Service Commission staff has discovery rights. They're the only party that does in the proceeding. And they submit a whole number of questions to the utility that the utility is required to respond to. During the 2019 IRP, the staff actually submitted more than 700 detailed questions that the company had to answer during the proceeding. Next is to mention is testimony pre-filing. There's 3 rounds of testimony, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Before each one, any expert that's going to appear during that set of hearings is required to pre-file the testimony. So people have an opportunity, usually a week or more, to look at the testimony before the upcoming hearing. And then the first set of hearings is on the utilities direct testimony. This will be in early April, and there'll be 3 consecutive days of hearings during which the utility, Georgia Power, will put on its case, as they say. The second set of hearings will be for staff and interveners, those people that are interested stakeholders that become parties to the case, for them to put on any expert witnesses that they have. The second set of hearings will be in late May, and those will go for 4 consecutive days of hearings. And by the way, I'll show you a schedule and a timeline for all of this in a moment, so you can look at it and how it lays out. And then the final set of hearings will be for Georgia Power's rebuttal testimony, and that will be late June for 2 consecutive days. In the next step is that in early July, all parties that want to may file a final brief in the proceeding. And then I put stipulation negotiations at this point in this diagram, but this is actually one of the kind of icons in this that might move to other places. Starting anytime, Georgia Power and the Public Service Commission staff can enter into stipulation negotiations. It typically starts in the wake of the staff and intervenor hearings, but that's not always the case. And once the company and the staff have hammered out a stipulation, they may invite other parties in the docket to sign on. The near final or the penultimate step is the advisory staff will make a recommendation to the commission. They do that at a regularly scheduled meeting. This is the last opportunity for parties to the case to actually speak. And then there'll be the final decision by the commission. Parties can't speak. This is a time for the commissioners to make the decision. It is also the point where they may introduce motions to amend the staff's recommendation in some way or another. Go ahead to the next slide. So as I said, here's a timeline that shows the current dates for the 2022 IRP. I won't go through everything, but you'll see it sort of spans till late July. There are the 3 set of hearings and the various deadlines that I mentioned. I'll make a couple notes. The early part of the IRP does overlap with the 2022 legislative session, so those are concurrent. Sometimes there's an interplay between what happens at the commission, what's happening at the legislature. And then I do want to make one note, is you'll note that one yellow flag that sticks out at the bottom of the timeline is before the IRP is even done, Georgia Power will turn around and file its 2022 rate case. These usually dovetail with each other or follow right on the heels. And so that process begins just as the IRP is winding down. Go ahead, next slide. So who decides the IRP? There are 5 elected public service commissioners in Georgia. They serve each staggered 6-year terms. The PSC commissioners are constitutional officers and they're elected statewide, but there is a rule that they must live in the PSC district that corresponds to the seat they hold. I will say it's a slightly funny system. They must live in a designated area, but it's important to remember they are elected statewide and they represent all Georgians. A few notes. 2 of the commissioners are up for election this year in 2022, Tim Eccles and Fitch Johnson. Tim Eccles, because it's the end of his normal term. Fitch Johnson was recently appointed to the commission by Governor Kemp. And so since he assumed the position through appointment, he has to run in the next general election. And by the way, if he's successful in 2022, he will actually have to stand for re-election in 24 at the end of the term that was started by his predecessor. And Patricia Pridemore there on the right, she was recently elected as the chair of the PSC by her peers, and she'll serve in that role for the next 2 years. Go ahead to the next slide. So who gets involved in IRPs, who shows up? I'll describe the organizations that typically intervene in IRP proceedings in 5 groups. First is a company. And the company brings many people into the proceedings, including its lawyers, which is Troutman Pepper, its regulatory staff, and its expert witnesses. Then there's the Public Service Commission staff. The staff is divided into 2 internal teams. One is the public interest advocacy staff, and the other is the advisory staff. I won't at this time go into the distinction why it's important, but if anybody has any questions about that, we can talk about it later. And the staff will sponsor numerous expert witnesses during the proceeding. Then there are user groups or trade associations. Some examples are the Georgia Industrial Group or the Georgia Association of Manufacturers. These groups typically represent large Georgia Power customers that use a lot of electricity. I will say, I have a hope as more companies focus on sustainability and embrace clean energy goals, we hope that the trade associations will become more robust advocates for clean energy solutions. The next group I want to describe is generator groups or trade associations. And so these groups typically represent third-party generators. In recent IRPs, that's mostly solar providers like the Georgia Large Scale Solar Association, but other independent power producers have also shown up in past IRPs. And then the final group I describe is advocates and non-governmental organizations. There's a range of advocate organizations that intervene, including at least the ones in that you see in this box. Go ahead to the next slide. So we've seen the filing, and I want to give you a very high level summary. Now you have to understand I'm summarizing roughly 2,000 pages of filing and about nearly 100 different spreadsheets. So we'll call this a very high level summary. So the load and energy forecast, as I said, this is kind of an important first step in the IRP. So over the planning horizon of 20 years, so that's from 2022 to 2041, Georgia Power projects that total energy sales will grow at an average rate of 0.8% year over year, and that the summer and winter peak demands will increase at an average rate of 0.7 per year. Just to make sure kind of everybody understands, energy sales are the total megawatt hours that they sell. The peak demand is that's sort of single hour. You can think of it on their system where they're going to experience the greatest peak demand. And that kind of defines the moment that they have to plan the system, be able to meet that demand. Reliability, planning, and the target reserve margin. Quickly, so people understand, the target reserve margin is the amount of energy resources measured in capacity that the utility needs to have above and beyond that projected peak demand that I just mentioned. And so the reserve margin helps the utility deal with any uncertainty. And so the reserve margin that they're planning is a long-term summer reserve margin of 16.25% and a winter reserve margin of 26%. I'll mention it briefly, but I'm not going to dwell on it. The issue of winter reliability and winter peak is becoming more and more important for Georgia Power. And so this issue will get a lot of discussion during the IRP. And just so everybody understands, in this process, Georgia Power's first identified capacity need, that year where they don't have adequate capacity to meet demand, is 2029. And it's driven by both summer and winter peak demands. Supply side, in terms of retirements, Georgia Power actually proposes to retire a number of units. They're proposing to retire 12 coal and oil-fired units over the next 7 years. And then, in addition, they're proposing to certify an additional more than 2,300 megawatts of capacity in what are called power purchase agreements. So they would basically purchase that power from third-party providers. All those are from existing natural gas units that are in Alabama and Georgia. So both significant retirements and significant new capacity they're bringing online. In terms of renewable resources, the company proposes the procurement of 2,300 megawatts of new renewable resources by 2025. So that's over the next 3 years. And that's broken down as 2,100 megawatts of utility scale solar and 200 megawatts of distributed generation. They are proposing a number of subscription programs. I mentioned before, they are proposing the new Clean and Renewable Energy Subscription Program, or CARES, that will be for commercial customers. They also are proposing an income qualified community solar program, which I think is an important step toward enhanced solar access for the company. And I will say, kind of setting up for stuff that Marilyn will talk about, this is one element of the IRP that clearly aligns with Drawdown Georgia's high impact electricity solutions of more large scale solar. Energy efficiency, also known as demand side management. That's the term that's usually actually used in the proceeding, but the overall portfolio that Georgia Power has of 7 residential and 4 commercial energy efficiency programs is really mostly the same as it has been. There's a few alterations. They are proposing to expand income qualified energy efficiency offerings, which I think is an important element of the filing. And again, this is another element of the IRP that does align with Drawdown Georgia's high impact solutions, which is promoting demand response. And finally, energy storage. There's a big emphasis in this IRP on expanding energy storage. They're proposing to develop 1,000 megawatts of energy storage systems, so batteries and other systems, to support the integration of renewables into their system. So as I said, that's a very kind of high level summary. So I've glossed over a number of issues. If you didn't hear something from me, we can talk about that in the Q&A. Go ahead to the next slide. So I want to close by talking about ways to get involved in the IRP. There's a variety of ways to get involved, and I'll describe several approaches. And first really is most basic, following the docket. All of the proceedings are available through they have a YouTube channel for the Public Service Commission. And so they're available to watch live, and then they're also available on a recorded basis. So anyone can watch and track the proceedings. In terms of attending the proceedings, things are a little bit different since the pandemic. They're doing what is called a hybrid approach, and I'll mention this again in a moment. Typically right now, the people being allowed into the hearing room is usually, it used to be anybody in the public, but now it's just lawyers and expert witnesses because of pandemic restrictions. The next thing that is available to folks is making public comment. At the outset of the first 2 rounds of hearing, the Georgia PSC takes public comment. And so those wishing to make public comment can sign up with the Public Service Commission staff. And the PSC typically allows commenters 3 to 5 minutes to speak to commissioners. Now, it's important to note that this process has changed fundamentally during the pandemic, and it's a little uncertain when it's going to kind of revert to what it used to be. So right now, actually, commissioners are only taking written comment. That may change in this docket. We haven't heard yet. But anyway, those sets of hearings, again, to reiterate, will be early April and then late May, and those are the 2 hearings during which the commission takes public comments. Meeting with commissioners. Again, to stress, commissioners are popularly elected constitutional officers, and anyone can contact their commissioner and request a meeting. So one-on-one meetings can be a good opportunity to make commissioners aware of specific issues of concern. So, and if anybody wanted to set up a meeting with a commissioner, you can contact the commissioners directly on the PSC website. There's a Meet the Commission pages, and there's a function there to go ahead and request a meeting with the commissioners. That's a good way to communicate with the commissioners. And finally, there's intervening in the docket. And intervening in the docket entails becoming a formal party to the proceeding. And if anybody wants to know more about how you go about that, we can talk about that later. I don't think we'll go into detail on intervention right now. Go ahead to the closing slide, I think I'm all done. So thank you for the opportunity to talk today, and I will turn it back over to Blair.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. Before we turn the mic over, I thought I would just ask one quick follow-up question for you. We've talked about now how Georgia Power has filed their plan. I'm curious historically how much that plan changes over the course of the IRP process.
That's a great question. And I think that in truth, I would say that, and I'll make up a number, I would say at least 85% of what goes in the front end largely comes out the back end. IRPs are complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on. There is deference to the company in terms of understanding their own business. So I'd say most of it that comes in the filing will be what's approved at the end. There are certain important changes that can be made. For instance, there will be a lot of debate, for instance, about the scale of the solar procurement, and that has actually changed significantly in past IRPs, and that's something that the commissioners really focus on. There have been in some past cases an expansion of energy efficiency programming, though that's more rare than expansion in solar. So there are some important changes that take place. But I would say that the kind of vast majority of what goes in the front end is what gets approved in the final proceeding.
Thank you. So Marilyn, with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
All right, that was a great overview, Kevin. Thank you so much. You covered a lot that will be important for the context of this comparison of the treatment of Drawdown Georgia's 20 high impact solutions in the IRP. So let's go to the next slide. That was what Blair asked me to do, is to address the question, answer the question of how consistent is the IRP with the aspirations that are documented in our various assessments of what could potentially occur in terms of drawing down carbon in the state of Georgia. So we started our work on looking at the possibilities in Georgia by creating a Sankey diagram. You know, at Georgia Tech, we like diagrams, we like numbers. But what you just should hover over here is the upper left-hand number here, 52.1 to 52.1 million tons of CO2 back in the year 2017 was the emissions. 52 million metric tons of CO2 was emitted from electricity generation in 2017. That number is a bit smaller now, but nonetheless, it is the second largest source of CO2 and is something maybe 37 or 38% of the total today. So we can't solve the greenhouse gas problem in Georgia without decarbonizing our electricity sector. Let's go to the next. Our roll-up of the 20 high-impact solutions in terms of their ability to reduce emissions over the 2017 to 2030 period. Remember that I hope you all know about the project because we were looking at high impact solutions that targeted significant reductions by the year 2030. This was not an assessment of research that might derive new technologies that could begin to play out in the mid-century timeframe. We really wanted to look at what the actions in the near term might be. And other than the carbon sinks that are shown along the top here of this diagram, you begin, which are worth about 48 or something million tons of CO2, very important to the state of Georgia. But the 20 solutions, one by one, are shown in the colorful rainbow of solutions beneath the carbon sinks. And the first one that you can see an icon sitting on is utility scale or large scale solar. If I had wanted to place the others that you saw as my target for today's talk, there would be 4 more of them in pink, and then one of them in yellow, which is retrofitting, and electric vehicles might have been on this chart as well, if I had had a chance to put squeeze all those icons on. So let's go to the next slide. So that's what we assessed was the possible reduction of CO2 from those 6 or 7 key solutions. So how might the IRP move the needle on climate change, especially with respect to the 7 solutions? I keep wavering between 6 and 7 because I'm not going to have a chance to talk about electric vehicles. In any event, they're not in the IRP, so we can save some time by just erasing that topic altogether. So thank you. Here are the 5 topics, 5 solutions that directly address the electricity generation opportunity. Let's go to the next slide. I've piled some statistics in here. Again, reiterating that in the 2022 IRP calls for 2,100 megawatts of utility scale solar. It's by far the biggest opportunity in the IRP for reducing Georgia's CO2 emissions. And as Kevin mentioned, the 2,100 megawatts are going to be subscribed to various consumers, according to the chart that's shown here in gray, using the Clean and Renewable Energy Subscription Program that's modeled after the current CRSP program. I did want to hit the previous chart, go back, the last bullet underneath that one there. It says, includes an income qualified community solar pilot with 75% discounted blocks of solar for income qualified consumers. So that's very notable. Next. So how does this compare to what we thought could be delivered if the achievable scenario of Drawdown Georgia were to be realized through the IRP? So the IRP calls for something like 4.1, a solar that will amount to about 4.1 gigawatts of utility scale solar by the year 2030. I have to qualify my statements that sometimes I'm not entirely sure the dates and numbers. It might be that this was for 2035, but they're short. Our goal was we thought that 5.4 gigawatts of new utility scale solar could be in place by the year 2030, compared to the forecast by the Department of Energy's modeling that we use of 2.6. So clearly the Georgia Power Plan exceeds the Energy Information Administration's forecast, but it falls short of what we thought was achievable. What we modeled as achievable would have delivered 11.2 million tons of CO2 reduction by the year 2030. So we're going to fall short, but still achieve a lot in the solar sphere with the IRP. Next. I wanted to highlight with respect to rooftop solar that the IRP falls way short of what we had estimated was possible for Georgia. The plan calls for 200 megawatts of distributed generation. And I want to show you this chart here that compares how Georgia is doing with respect to solar, utility scale, and rooftop solar relative to the United States. So first, in terms of renewables, in 2019, Georgia had generated 9% of its electricity from renewables, while the United States average is 18%. So we fall short on renewables. The big renewables in our portfolio are hydro and biomass and solar, increasingly solar. Now just look at the yellow bars, and that amplifies the way that solar is used in Georgia versus the US. So in the United States, 14.9% of its renewables are from solar. In the state of Georgia, 18.9% of our renewables are from solar. So we are solar heavy, which is great. We have the resource, other states don't. But when you compare the treatment of rooftop solar, you'll see that in the United States, 5.1% of that 14.9% is from rooftop solar, while in Georgia, 0.3% of the 18.9% are from rooftop solar. So we are way behind in terms of meeting any kind of sense of what could be achieved by putting solar panels on our rooftops. So let's go to the next slide. All of this solar ultimately is going to cause coal to be retired. And I wanted to flag here a great map of the states of Alabama and Georgia, because we need to consider both states since we do get significant electricity from the state of Georgia. This uses our Drawdown tracker, which you can learn all about tomorrow on a webinar that will be starting up at 3 o'clock. Maybe Blair could put a note on that in the chat. So you can see the Shearer coal plant is pointed to in the little box there with a black arrow, and above Atlanta you see Bowen. Above Atlanta, covering Atlanta, you see McDonough, which is a big gas plant, and to the northwest of it is Bowen. But what you don't often think about is the fact that to the left, southeast of Birmingham in Alabama is a plant that is owned by Georgia Power and provides significant coal to us, as well as Plant Miller, which is the big brown circle of, again, another coal plant outside of Birmingham. We don't, to my knowledge, import from there, but just highlighting it. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Here is where our rooftop solar potential resides. Of course, it's where populations are, and to date, it has been significantly moved forward in the several mini large cities that have solarized projects. When we assessed potential for Georgia, for Drawdown Georgia, we looked at what the current market might deliver, what the achievable potential is, and what's the technical potential. So the technical potential for rooftop solar is to reduce 12 million tons of CO2 if every rooftop that had sun exposure were to be covered with solar. So obviously that's not viable, but we're not, with the IRP, going to achieve even a small fraction of that. Okay, next chart. And here's some of how we did our modeling and our assessment of the savings that can be achieved if individuals are provided with net metering. However, net metering is not part of the IRP. The IRP does not support the resale of excess electricity from customer sites back to the utility at retail rate. Okay, next. So there are a couple of other solutions that, besides electric vehicles, that are overlooked in the IRP. One of them is cogeneration. Now, I have to confess, I only looked at the main document and the technical study of options. And cogeneration, otherwise sometimes known as combined heat and power, did not appear in did not pop up in any of my search functions. And this is a wonderful option for Georgia. We are a highly industrialized state, and we produce a lot of biomass. That biomass can co-produce electricity, can generate excess electricity for, in the case of Albany Green, military purposes, as well as sending it back to Georgia Power that buys the excess from this Albany Green biomass plant. It can provide a clean platform for integrating green gas, green hydrogen, renewable natural gas, and has an efficiency that averages between 85 and 90%. 20% more efficient than the state-of-the-art natural gas plant. So just on efficiency grounds alone, this is a winning technology, and I hope it will be reconsidered. Next, we have a lot of sites where co-production of electricity and heat could occur. These are the location of 41 current combined heat and power facilities in Georgia, and we estimated. So one of the ways that I remember what we estimated as our carbon reduction opportunities. Can everyone see our cards? We have a game, a drawdown game. Utility scale solar is the winning card. And then you have retrofitting. Yes, we'll talk about that. And then cogeneration. It is number 8 in terms of what it can deliver and at what price. So, it's there and we don't want to overlook it. Okay, next. Now, landfill methane is mentioned in the IRP. So over there on the right, you can see the IRP promises that it will have 480 megawatts of biomass and landfill gas by the end of 2024. It currently has 390. So this is, a very small uptick. And I think, again, an under-emphasized opportunity. Capped landfills produce methane gas through anaerobic digestion, and then it's piped in. It can create either renewable natural gas, or it can be used to create electricity. So we go to the next slide. We've done some assessment of where landfill gas plants are located and what condition they're in terms of the biomass, the waste that's being delivered there. Is it sufficient? And is the landfill plant capped? In across Georgia, we see that publicly owned landfills often are not capped, typically are not, and most of them do not have, therefore, any kind of landfill gas collection system. So it seems like an opportunity that we should take advantage of. And the EPA agrees that there is an advantage to doing that in the state of Georgia. We have some high potential locations for collecting landfill gas, preventing it from going into the atmosphere and from polluting the local communities, which, by the way, do tend to be resource constrained. That's where you find landfills. Okay, next. Demand response is, I'm pleased to say, prioritized to some extent in the IRP. I think it could be prioritized more, but there are a number of programs that will be continued, such as the Residential Thermostat Demand Response Program, And there are a few new tariffs. I have not had a chance to dig deep into this demand response credit tariff or the resilience asset service tariff, but I like the sound of them and hope to get familiar with them. This is a great way to help integrate renewables by combining renewables with demand response, so that when you need to bridge when the sun's down and you've got a bridge across the evening hour, a little bit of demand response could help make that happen. Next. Here's how it works. So, you've got a programmable thermostat, you've got a garage, you've got your lithium-ion batteries, and probably have your EV charger. Again, they're not mentioned in this IRP, and your heat pump water heater. All of it controlled locally and at the control, in this case, in this subdivision, of Georgia Power. So solar on the rooftop, all these electric devices in these houses, and it is really a sight to be seen, the Pulte homes. Hope you get a chance to view them. We need more of those. This was a pilot, a Georgia Power pilot. Next. Buildings and materials. So now we're into a new section of our Drawdown Georgia solutions, diverting from electricity generation to how we use electricity. And in this case, I wanted to highlight the retrofitting opportunity. And Dan Matisoff led this for us. So the next chart shows in the IRP, the proposed continuation of some demand-side management programs, decertification of a couple, extension of some, and certification of one new residential program, the Income Qualified Residential Investment for Savings Energy RISE pilot. So there is some expansion, but it looks very modest to me. There's one, I did find a interesting factoid. Maybe it's on the previous slide. Can you go back one, Jan? Oh, no, forward again. Maybe it's on the next slide. How Georgia Power, let's go one more. How Georgia Power compares in terms of the savings. Okay, there it is. In 2019, at the bottom of the diagram there, of the photos, savings as a percent of sales for Georgia Power were only 0.5% compared to the average of 1% for the US. So first note that we are behind. Overall, we're starting from a insufficient base of support for energy efficiency programs. And we have some of the most inefficient buildings in the country, inefficient homes, some of the biggest energy burden rates, and the opportunity is here to do so much more. Let's go back. I'm not sure what I missed there. Oh, yes, I wanted to show that we are doing some geospatial modeling of where we find these solutions. And in this case, we looked at where are heat pumps, because as we try to electrify more of our homes and buildings, and of course, transportation, heat pumps are going to rise to the top of our popular solutions because they offer such great efficiency and cost effectiveness, but they are not operating in large numbers in the state of Georgia compared to the state of Tennessee, for instance, where, as you might know, I was a regulator of TVA for 8 years, and we pushed heat pumps, and we had a lot of heat pumps. Kevin, you heard John Wilson talk about, is Georgia Power summer peaking or winter peaking? Georgia Power is summer peaking because it doesn't use a lot of heat pumps in the winter. Tennessee is winter peaking because that's when everybody turns their heat pump on. And we've chosen, for some reason, that the state agencies and utilities have not been pushing heat pumps, and yet they are a important technology going forward. So that's a big, heat pumps are not in the IRP. Heat pumps are not mentioned in the my scan of the IRP. Okay, next, and keep on. So that's my scan of how the IRP maps onto our 20 solution high impact list. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. That was really helpful. You know, one of the things that kind of underpinned your conversation is the fact that Georgia Power is proposing to close a bunch of its coal units. And so I'm curious, as you look at both their proposal and what your research, how would you like to see them replace that capacity that's proposed to close?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I'm glad about is that they are not proposing to build any new natural gas plants. They are planning on procuring more natural gas from existing plants, which is probably necessary to some extent, but I think is potentially overdone in the IRP proposal. I would prefer to see more demand response and more energy efficiency. We saw 0.5% per year opportunity that where we could reduce demand relative to what's happening in other states. I think that we need to build a virtual power plant out of energy efficiency and demand response. That's what we did at TVA. We talked about the virtual power plants that can be built with different attributes, just like a coal plant or just like a gas plant. So that's what I would hope for, more of those.
Well, thank you. And Cicely, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you for that tough act to follow. Dr. Brown always has really good information. So I was asked today to come on behalf of Partnership for Southern Equity and talk about some of the equity issues in the IRP. And just to give people a little background, because we've used so many acronyms. So I'm from Partnership for Southern Equity, PSE, not to be confused with PSC, the Public Service Commission. We are very, very different entities. But Partnership for Southern Equity advances policies and institutional actions that promote racial equity and shared prosperity and growth in both Metro Atlanta and the American South. And, you know, we primarily, when it comes to our just energy portfolio, we primarily work with Black people, communities of color, marginalized and low wealth communities, basically the global majority, to understand the sourcing and commodification of power generation, and to take action in support of equity-centered energy, utility, and climate programs and policies. So that is primarily our interest in the integrated resource plan, is because it affects the communities that is the focus of our work and beyond. And because it greatly affects those communities, then that's why we feel like we should have a role and an interest in advocating for changes in the IRP. Next slide. So I was asked to come and talk about equities, and you can click in. And so, you know, if you go through the IRP, the word equity actually only appears 3 times. It might actually be 2, but I think it's 3 times total in the whole 1,500 pages. So, you know, it is kind of hard to, you know, have a focus and a priority on equity if you don't actually use the word, you know, through several pages of the documents, and then you can hit it again. And so, you know, and the use of the word actually doesn't appear in the context and how most of us would use equity. It is used as an explanation for how they are, one of their measurements of assessing equity in some of the interventions and programs offered within the IRP. And so it's only mentioned in there in context of explaining this definition. So not even in layman's terms or usage throughout the document. And so, you know, that sort of gives you a perspective of where this is coming from. Next slide. So what they do speak a lot about is energy efficiency. And you'll find a lot of this in Chapter 8. And as Kevin mentioned, what they will affectionately describe as demand side, or part of their demand side strategy. And so when you look in this section, you'll see that, they talk about that the demand side management is an important resource mix for them. So, that's a combination of both programs, energy, demand response programs, energy efficiency programs, policies, pricing, tariffs, other energy efficiency initiatives are all part of one of their main strategies there. And so, as Kevin mentioned, they have offered to extend most of their core programs that they already have, as well as some expansion in income qualified programs. And to define income qualified programs, that basically means that for most of the programs, your household income is 200% or less of the US federal poverty lines. And so, all these programs are currently in existence, and you can find out more about them on their website. I highlighted the programs in green because these programs are the ones that are specific to income qualified program. The other energy efficiency programs, not to say that they aren't as useful, they are more broader terms. So the first one is, about doing education and awareness around energy efficiency in K through 12. The second one is just more general to the public around energy efficiency. And then you have some programs contained in there that are income specific. And the HopeWorks program is income qualified and also for seniors. And so even out of the full list of programs, there are 4 programs that are specific for those who are income qualified and the population who is most likely to be energy burdened. Hence the need for us to talk about some of the equity issues that could be either gained or lost with the IRP. So while I do think it is good that they are proposing to expand some of the programming, I have to say that, expansion is relative. So one of the programs that, they're talking about expanding or extending is the RISE pilot. The original program around the RISE pilot was for them to reach 500 households for the whole state of Georgia. So, expansion, how much does that mean? And was 500 even a good place to start if we think about the full state of Georgia of people qualified for the programs? And then how effective are these current programs in reaching those target populations that it is meant to? These are all questions that I think need to be answered in greater detail in order for us to have a greater satisfaction about how IRP aligns and, where does equity show up in this and how does it come out in our day-to-day. So next slide. And so, I think I like to think of them as opportunities for, IRP, not IRC, typo there. So opportunities for IRP going forward. And so one of them I think is, a movement to prioritize people over profits. And so I'm not saying that as a for-profit business, they totally throw out the baby with the bathwater, but I do think that it is really hard to reach somewhere with satisfaction to what us as community partners and other interested parties would want to see with equity if there isn't some centering of people. And so what you measure is what matters, and all the ways in which they measure even energy efficiency and other things that are indicators don't specifically measure equity, and they don't talk about it in terms of people. They have what they call total resource cost, or you'll see TRCs in the document. And that's how they measure success. And so if you're measuring success based on that and not people, then it is really hard for you to ever end up at some equity place that greatly benefits the public. And so I think there are some opportunities for them to do that in it. And then to also think about how effective are the programs in relative to the population that is intended to benefit from it. And with that, I mean, there are some opportunities where a lot of the programs, even if you look on the website, are primarily made for residential or single family owners, but a lot of them are most energy burdened persons or renters and or live in multifamily. And so how do we also make sure that these incentives and programs benefit people who may be renters or in multifamily dwellings as well, and expand income qualified programs as they relate to that as both under energy efficiency and as a move toward equity. you can keep clicking through. I also think that if it matters, then you also need to dedicate adequate resources to the income-specific energy efficiency programs, as well as the community partners. And so I don't think that Georgia Power needs to be all things to all people. There are lots of us on the outside who could do that and help make the translation. There are lots of us who have really great ideas, like Dr. Brown gave you 20 plus slides on how things could be better. So I don't actually think that they should be making it all up themselves, but before you produce this 1,500 page document every 3 years, why not ask us and then actively include some of the shaping of programs and policies that is to come from it, from those who know best from the outside and from the people who are most affected by it. And then I also think one of the things that I think is a barrier, and Kevin mentioned this, I mean, there's hundreds of pages of charts and words that it took all of us. I mean, Dr. Brown's a PhD, I am not, but the amount of time it takes to comb through it for things that affect all of the population, then I do think the data and information should be presented in a more palatable format. It should be information that should be able to be interpreted or at least understandable or accessible by all. And just putting it on the website in a PDF, and because we can search for it and bring it up, does not make it accessible or therefore useful to all of who is affected by it. And so I definitely think there needs to be a move toward how information is presented, how it is conveyed, how it is described, if it is intended for all of us to participate in this process. And especially for those most affected, if you are really going to get at the heart of equity, I shouldn't have to be on this webinar to speak on behalf of others. People should be able to speak and advocate for what it is they need for themselves. And there should be a greater connection between that and how we present information, even, you know, if it's important. I don't know that it needs to be this level of what you need to have to be able to understand something that affects a great portion of the population. And so these are what I see as opportunities for the IRP moving forward. And as Kevin said, you know, a good portion of it may not shift, but I don't think that, you know, that is where we accept that and leave. I think we keep pushing, even if it's for incremental change, and eventually it leads to large scale change. But I think there are definitely opportunities that, you know, do not require, well, I feel like what would be a lot to ask, but I think would make tremendous strides and efforts, and what the rest of us would like to see on the outside.
Thank you, Cicely. Before we turn to kind of an open Q&A, we're getting lots of questions in the chat about people saying, if they want to get involved, what are kind of the pathways and avenues, and what are ways that they can do that in an effective way?
Yeah, I mean, I think for one, making this a more commonplace conversation. I think it took a while for climate change and other stuff to become mainstream. And I think to keep pushing this forward, because I think that most people, regardless of their socioeconomic status or background, most people are not aware of IRP or how it affects them or how to get involved. And so I think people who are aware and who know, invite other people into the conversation. You know, most people aren't aware of the Public Service Commission and how they can vote for who sits in that office, and you know, who's going to help influence and make these decisions. Almost all of us are Georgia Power customers. And so I think, you know, ways for people to just even amplify the message and make people aware of what's there is a way to get involved. I also think on the links I dropped in the chat when Kevin was talking about, you could see the docket on the Public Service Commission's website. It also lists on there what other organizations are intervening on different parts of the integrated resource plan. And so if you happen to know or support those organizations, then I say get involved in an organization that is intervening and see how you could best support their work with the intervening for the IRP, and continue, you know, to work in those methods as well, and advocate and leverage whatever your social capital is to get the word out about IRP.
Great. I'm going to try to get some of the questions that we've received through the Q&A box. If there are other questions that come to mind, feel free to populate that. Kevin, I'm going to kick it off with kind of an overall question from you about who does the PSC actually regulate? There was questions about how EMCs are involved, as well as the gas utilities like Atlanta Gas Light.
Sure. The role of the Public Service Commission is to regulate investor-owned utilities, both in the electric and gas space. So there's only one investor-owned electric utility in the state, that's Georgia Power. Some people may remember there used to be Savannah Electric, which was a second one, and that was subsumed into Georgia Power. So there's one electric IOU. And on the gas side, it's a little bit different, but the Atlanta Gas Light is the regulated provider in a deregulated market. So they are regulated. They are the pipes only company that basically delivers gas up to the meter at your house. And then there's a series of marketers who actually sell gas to individuals in the deregulated portions of the state. And the marketers are also regulated, but in a different way. But Atlanta Gas Light is a fully regulated investor-owned utility on the gas side. And there is one other, used to be Atmos Gas, is now, I think, Liberty Gas, and they serve Gainesville and maybe Columbus. So there's one other investor-owned gas utility in the state. They do have other responsibilities, like they regulate throughout the state for underground facilities protection. So the call before you dig and all of those rules, they regulate that, and any violations of GUFPA, which is the law. And then going back to the electric utilities. So as I mentioned, there are 94 other utilities in the state, and those are electric membership co-ops. And the cities that serve as utilities, what are often called munis, they are not regulated except in very small ways by the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission does regulate all territorial disputes. So no matter who, between EMC, Muni, or Georgia Power, and on the gas side, between a city and Atlanta Gas Light, of who serves a particular area, the Public Service Commission has jurisdiction over that, but they don't regulate rates for EMCs. They don't do an integrated resource planning process for EMCs or munis. And so really, if you're an EMC member, the entity that you want to appeal to for how the EMC is operated is the board of directors. And so if you're an EMC member, you are a member of that company and you can attend those meetings. And then on the city side, it would be your city commission that really regulates the utility. The utility might have an authority associated with it, and the authority should also hold public meetings.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We're going to dig into some questions that are about two specific technologies. First, we're going to look at rooftop solar and then move to heat pumps. So we had a few questions on rooftop solar. Maybe Marilyn, you can start first about why the uptake is so low, and you were showing how little of our solar generation is coming from rooftop solar. And then perhaps for either Marilyn or Kevin, if net metering is not covered in the IRP, where can people kind of get involved in that process? When will that come up as an issue?
All right. Yep, we don't have a lot of rooftop solar in the state of Georgia. Unlike, as I showed you, the rest of the US in particular, California, Southwest, more in Florida. But there is a movement that's caused some retrenchment, even in those states that have been leaders in rooftop solar. So the past maybe 3 or 4 months have seen a lot of reconsideration by regulators of net metering and other programs that have promoted rooftop solar. And the argument has been one of equity. In order to offer a net metering option, the utility has to, they argue, raise rates in order to provide that extra revenue to those who have solar on their rooftop to cover the net metering. And that extra revenue has got to come from somewhere. So it comes from rates that must rise, and everyone pays the differential. So the people who are paying the differential are all ratepayers, but those who are benefiting are only those with solar rooftops. And of course, that's not everybody, that's the affluent. So there is an equity concern. And as a result, Georgia Power is proposing to pull the plug on any net metering and not to continue or expand the one pilot program that they had for the first 5,000 rooftops that asked for net metering that ended. It kept last summer, maybe it was 6 months ago or so. They hit the 5,000 mark and it came to an end. So it's interesting that that equity is used as the reason to not do the environmentally best thing. There's a lot of research on what is the value of solar. Solar, if it's displacing fossil fuels, offers a lot of value in terms of clean air, and that's not factored in. So we don't have the water pollution that comes from a lot of many power plants. That's not factored into the benefits that solar can provide. So taking a very narrow view of benefits and an expanded concern for equity has led to across the from Florida to California and across to New England reconsideration of net metering. I fear it's going to dial back in many places over the next while.
So Kevin or Cicely, where will the net metering conversation emerge, if anywhere, when it comes to the IRP and the Public Service Commission?
I could respond to that. So make sure everybody's kind of on board. Historically, Georgia Power used to do what was kind of called instantaneous netting. So when you sold your excess power back to the grid, they would pay you what was avoided cost. So let's call it 3 cents kilowatt hour, even though you were buying retail electricity from the company at roughly an average of 13 cents. And so in the 2019 rate case, the Public Service Commission started the pilot that Marilyn mentioned with this 5,000 customer cap. And under that, they would actually net it out at the end of the month. So really, at least up to the amount that you used, that energy that you exported to the grid, you got it at your retail value at that 13-cent value instead of the 3-cent value. And I think, as Marilyn explained pretty well, that pilot hit its cap very quickly. I think maybe more quickly than most people anticipated. It is a position of the commissioners that it's not an IRP issue and that it is a rate case issue. And Georgia Power has said in the IRP very briefly, they don't support an expansion of the net metering program, but that's not really to be debated, at least by their account or by the commissioner's account, and then it will be taken up in the 2022 rate case.
Great, thank you. There was a question responding to Marilyn's
Blair,
slide.
could I add one thing? Sorry.
Oh, sure.
So I do want to point out in the chat, there's a couple mentions. So I think if people are interested in the net metering issue, there are actually, there's one bill active in the legislature right now. You can see Henry Slack's comment on HB 1083. SB 299 was introduced last session. I believe it's being reinvented right now and actually be reintroduced. So that will be 2 bills in the legislature in this session that will also address the net metering issue. So I would certainly encourage folks to get involved in that, contact their legislators and understand what's happening on the legislative front related to net metering.
Great, thank you. And that answers some questions about the interplay between the legislative session. So thanks for addressing that. There was a question building off of Marilyn's slide around heat pumps. It says, is Southern Company owns both Georgia Power and Georgia Natural Gas. What's their business motivation to promote heat pumps? I don't know who wants to take that one.
Oh, that's one of my favorite topics. I'll jump in first. Yes, exactly. What's their motivation? And that's not the justification for helping to provide least cost energy services, which is what I believe they're required to do, right? Choose the least cost method of meeting demand. The least cost method could involve heat pumps, which might jeopardize some natural gas sales. And I think there probably is a trade-off being debated at high levels, the corporate leadership in Georgia, and just deciding. I mean, at TVA is no brainer. The TVA wanted heat pumps because that would ensure an electric advantage. Some customers who might have gone to gas water heaters or gas heating systems could be, won over by offering them a credit or some kind of an incentive for heat pumps. So it was kind of the same thing. TVA was promoting electrification, And I don't think that the Georgia Power Company is promoting, out and out electrification. I don't think that's not in their planning specifications.
We have time for one more question before we hit our 3:15 mark, and I'm going to lob this over to Cicely. I know you answered it in the Q&A, but I think it's really helpful. Someone flagged, that this is really dense information. It's not always easily accessible. So how do you recommend that people stay engaged and stay informed?
Yeah, so, myself, Kevin has been involved on behalf of South Base and Vote Solar. We have been hosting a 6-part series on integrated resource plan that's meant to be a training to help bring more people into the fold and be prepared and understand for what comes out. Our last part of the series is next month on March 9th. It's Wednesday from 3:30 to 5. I think someone, or not myself, in a moment will drop the link in there. It's open to anyone who wants to attend. You can also go back if you sign up for it and see the previous sessions. And so our goal with that was to make it a more palatable process. And now that the document is out, part of our next session will be going over and highlighting some things that are important for people in the document. I also think some of our partners, like South Base and some others, will likely sort of produce a Cliff's Notes version for those of us who are old enough to remember that in the room, which is sort of a high level thing. So you have to get through the whole 1,500 pages. But ultimately, those are Band-Aids, right? So I think in the long term, Georgia Power and others like it should have an obligation to the public to produce a document that is palatable to the public, similar to like a newspaper. That people can understand and get into, and then have a deeper document for those of us who want to get all into the numbers, but people should at least be able to understand what is happening with them and what is going on. And so I do think that is a charge, not just for Georgia Power, but all sorts of things in this vein about how do you make sure that if it is affecting large groups of people, and that those groups of people should be able to interpret and take in the information.
Thank you. And with that, I am going to close us out. Jen, if you want to move to the next slide. In addition to saying thank you to our amazing panelists for their presentations and for sharing all your knowledge with us today. I want to thank everyone who joined us. And before I close, I also want to share that we will have another Drawdown Georgia webinar tomorrow. So there are back-to-back opportunities to engage and learn with us. Tomorrow, we'll be joined by experts from Georgia Tech, including Dr. Brown, as well as from the University of Georgia, to share about the new Drawdown Georgia Greenhouse Gas Emissions Tracker that's now live on the Drawdown Georgia website. Although I just got pinged a minute ago that said the Microsoft platform that hosts it was temporarily down. So if you click and it doesn't come up, click again in about 5 minutes. But it is an exciting new resource for our state. So I hope you will join us again tomorrow to learn more. But thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Blair. Cicely.
Thank you all.
Good
Thank you all.
to see you.